Okay, so you've landed that big interview, and it's with a company that's really into React.js, huh? Well, good for you.
You're in the right place. We're about to take a deep dive into all things React, just enough to get you feeling confident and ready to nail that interview.
Love it. Everyone wants that secret handshake feeling, right? Like you've cracked the code.
Yeah.
But speaking of code, let's start with the basics. What exactly is React.js?
So React.js at its heart is a JavaScript library. Essentially, it's a toolbox full of pre-written code and its specialty, building those really sleek, dynamic user interfaces you see all over the web.
Ah, okay. So those websites that just feel super responsive, where everything loads smoothly,
Yeah.
that's often React doing its magic behind the scenes.
Exactly. And this is where things get interesting. React uses these things called components. Picture them as the building blocks of your web page.
Building blocks, I'm intrigued. How does that actually work in practice?
Think of it like building with Lego bricks. Each brick can be anything: a button, a text input box, even a whole image carousel. And get this, you can reuse these blocks anywhere you want. Need that same button somewhere else? No problem. Just grab the component.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Reusability is key. But what about that code they keep mentioning in job postings? You know, the stuff that looks like HTML, but with a bit of a JavaScript twist to it. It can be a bit daunting to look at.
You're talking about JSX. It might look a little funky at first, but trust me, it's incredibly powerful and elegant once you get used to it. Basically, JSX lets you combine the powers of JavaScript and HTML directly in your code.
So it's like speaking both languages at the same time. I like it.
Exactly. And this allows React to do some really cool stuff under the hood, like creating something called a virtual DOM, which is like a super efficient blueprint of your web page.
Wait, hold on. A blueprint, like for a house, but for a web page.
You got it. And this blueprint is key for performance. Instead of reloading the entire page every time something changes, React uses this virtual DOM to figure out the most efficient way to update only the parts that need changing.
Okay, that's some pretty clever optimization right there. So it's kind of like swapping out a single light bulb instead of having to rewire your entire house every time you want to turn on a light.
Exactly. And this all happens behind the scenes, resulting in a super smooth and fast user experience.
That's impressive. But I have a feeling interviewers aren't just going to ask us to explain what React is. They're going to want to see it in action, right?
Absolutely. A very common coding challenge you might get is to build a simple counter component. Don't let its simplicity fool you. It tests some pretty fundamental React concepts, things like state, event handling, and rendering.
Let's break it down then. How would you approach building a counter component in React? Walk us through it.
Okay, so first you'd create a new component. Let's call it counter. Inside this component, you'd define its initial state, in this case, a count value, which will start at 0. This state is like the component's memory.
So the component remembers that it starts at 0. Makes sense. Then what?
Then you need a way to actually interact with the counter. Typically, a button that, when clicked, increases the count.
Right, because otherwise it's just sitting there being 0, not very interactive.
Exactly. So you would add a button, and this is where event handling comes in. You would write a function within the counter component that gets triggered every time that button is clicked. This function would update the component state, increasing the count value by 1.
So when the user clicks, the component's memory, that count value, gets updated. And React knows to show the updated number on the screen. Pretty neat.
It is. And here's where things get even more powerful. Let's say you want to reuse this counter component in different parts of your app, but maybe with a different starting value. This is where props come into play.
Props. Fill us in.
Think of props like passing down instructions from a parent component to a child component. In this case, you could use props to tell the counter component, hey, instead of starting at 0, you're going to start at 10 this time, or 100, or whatever value you want.
So it's like giving the counter component specific instructions or settings. That's really flexible.
It is, and that flexibility is one of React's biggest strengths. It lets you build complex UIs with these reusable components.
Speaking of complex UIs, what happens when we're dealing with lists of things? Like, say, a to-do list where items can be added, deleted, reordered. How does React handle that efficiently?
That's where keys come in. In React, each item in a list needs a unique key. Think of it like a label that helps React keep track of each item, especially when the list changes.
So if we add a new to-do item, React knows exactly where to put it in the list thanks to these keys.
Precisely. It's all about optimization. Without these keys, React would essentially have to re-render the entire list every time something changed, which would be really inefficient.
Right, because if you have a really long list, you don't want the entire thing to have to reload every time you make a tiny change. That makes perfect sense.
And speaking of optimization, we can't forget about lifecycle methods. These are special functions that allow you to control what happens at different stages of a component's life, from the moment it's created and added to the page, to when it receives new data, to when it's finally removed from the page.
Okay, so it's like having checkpoints throughout a component's journey. And at each checkpoint, you can tell it to do specific things.
Yes, and this is really important for building performant React applications. Interviewers might ask you about lifecycle methods to see if you understand how to make React apps run smoothly and efficiently, even with lots of complex stuff happening.
So, for our listener who's about to head into that interview room, any final words of wisdom to help them stand out?
Absolutely. First and foremost, remember to breathe. Interviewers want to see you think, not just recite facts. So if you're hit with a coding challenge, talk through your thought process. Even if you don't have the perfect answer right away, showing how you approach a problem is super valuable. And hey, don't be afraid to ask clarifying questions. It shows you're engaged and eager to learn.
So much great advice. And honestly, at the end of the day, remember to relax a little. You got this.
You absolutely do. Now go out there and wow them with your React knowledge.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We're excited to see what amazing things you build. Until next time.